In this video, we'll be covering tokens in Fantasy Grounds Classic. I currently am using the 5th edition rule set, but everything that we cover will be applicable across all rule sets. So tokens are accessed primarily through the tokens banner down here at the bottom. And when we do, it opens up this window. Now you'll notice right off that the tokens view is different than just about any other type of data that we have in Fantasy Grounds. Nearly everything else will appear as a list of entries. Tokens, however, appear in this tokens view window. And this differs in that all of the things are sorted into these various token bags. And the tokens are displayed hierarchically, so there can be multiple levels of folders or bags going down. And the tokens are stored into these token bags and can be grouped together in folders on the disk. So when it comes to tokens, tokens are primarily used by the DM, and rarely, if ever, should tokens need to be shared with the players. One common mistake that DMs will often make is they'll go ahead and find a nice source of tokens or purchase a whole bunch of tokens and want to be able to share all of that with their players and or load all of them up all at the same time. Tokens can use up a lot of memory, and so this is a way to quickly run into memory issues or possibly crash your Fantasy Grounds instance if you find that you're loading too many. If you have thousands and thousands of tokens added, that can cause significant problems. Now, in Fantasy Grounds, tokens are just image files. Don't get confused with the NPC record. The NPC record contains all of the stats and associated images and everything for an NPC. A token is just strictly an image file. Tokens are normally PNG files, and they're used either to give a player character. You can select a token here, so that this is the image that will be used when that character is added from the combat tracker onto a map. And also for NPC records, there is a token location here that you can drag and drop that token to, so that that's the image that will be used for that NPC, again, when they're added to a map. Tokens, so as I said, tokens are normally in the PNG image format. And the size of the tokens is something to keep in mind in terms of the amount of memory used. Most of the tokens you find within published Fantasy Grounds modules is going to be somewhere between 50 by 50 pixels to 200 by 200 pixels, depending on the size of the creature that they're intended to represent. Something in that 100 to 200 range is usually pretty good. But remember that the tokens will be scaled to whatever the map is. So if the map is using 10 pixels for a 5-foot square and your token is added to that, your token may be shrunk down to the size of the 5-foot square, which is just the 10 pixels on each side. So you may not be able to see all of the details of your super highly graphic token. If you have 1,000 by 1,000 token, you really won't be able to see any of the details if something that large, when it's shrunk down and scaled to fit the size of the map. So manage the size of the tokens that you're using. Will also help to reduce the memory usage. If you have a lot of tokens, it's recommended that you create your own token module, and there's an excellent video done by Zacchaeus covering the process of creating your own token module, and I highly recommend that you go and watch that video. Token modules allow you to load and unload a group of tokens so that you don't have to have all of them being shared or all of them being loaded at the same time. Fantasy Grounds, thankfully, is smart enough that if you load a token module and you use one of the tokens from it, either on an NPC record, a PC record, or an encounter record, Fantasy Grounds will remember a link to that module. So even after you unload the module, those tokens will still be available. And we can see that actually demonstrated here I have a token bag here for FGC PCs. Now this is some tokens that came from a module that I used to import these player characters. And each of them had a token selected. And we can see those tokens are still being retained in memory even though that module is no longer loaded. So if I come here, and you can see here that I do not have that module loaded anymore. But Fantasy Grounds remembers that I'm still linking to those tokens, and so it'll remember the module and keep those available to me. So let's talk about where you get tokens from within Fantasy Grounds. So there's 5 different sources of tokens that you might be using. So the first one, and the one we just talked about, is modules. So if we go ahead and click on the modules button here on the tokens window, it'll open up the list of modules. Now you'll notice that this token module activation looks very similar to this library modules window. The difference is that every one here you'll see has this little bag symbol in the bottom right hand corner. This indicates that this module contains tokens. So on the token module activation window, you will only see modules that contain tokens. So if something does not contain tokens, it won't be listed here. Fantasy Grounds does include some default ones, these animal tokens, some character tokens, and a few others that you have access to. And then you can, of course, download them. Many products will come with tokens included, like, for example, the Creature Codex from Cobalt Press has a whole bunch of tokens included. Many of the adventure modules will also include them. So when you load a module, for example, if I load Volo's Guide to Monsters and I click load, it'll go ahead and load that up. And if I close the window, a new token bag will now appear here in this list. Here's the Volo's Guide to Monster token bag. If I open that up, I can then see all of the images, all of the tokens that are available within that module, and I can use them on my own NPCs or wherever I would like to. When I'm done with that and I've assigned everything, I can go ahead and unload that so that it's no longer using up memory. When you create your own token modules, they will also be on the list when you load them up here. Often you can search by author if you put in your own author name to make it easier to find your particular ones. The second source of tokens is the actual rule set that you are using. Now, 5th edition rule set does not contain any tokens included with it, but you will see a bag here for rule set. If there are any rule set related tokens that come with it, they will be included in there. Most that I've encountered do not have any. And then there are 2 special locations for tokens. You can see here at the bottom we have a GM button and a shared button. These are 2 locations within our Fantasy Grounds data folder. So if I open up our Fantasy Grounds data folder and I bring that over here. So this is our Fantasy Grounds data folder. Don't worry if you don't have the exact same files that I do, but it should generally look the same. And you'll notice here that there is a tokens directory. If it's not there, you can create it here in the Fantasy Grounds data folder. And within the tokens directory, there will be 2 more directories, the host directory and the shared directory. In looking at Fantasy Grounds, the GM button points to this host directory, and the shared button points to this shared directory. So any tokens that we add into here will then get added to Fantasy Grounds. The difference is that tokens added to the host directory, or in Fantasy Grounds the GM, will be available to the DM or the GM in every campaign that they load. But they will not be available to players. They're not shared with the players. So I keep a folder here called Miscellaneous, and I have a variety of different tokens that I want to have available to me for any specific campaign or game that I want. I can create additional folders. So let's say I want to create a new folder, and I'll call this My Tokens. And let's go ahead and add some tokens into it. in this case, I have some Goblin tokens from one of Devon Knight's packs that I purchased, and I'm just going to copy them over. So now I've got some Goblin tokens here in this host directory. Once I do that, if I come back here, you can see now it's created an additional token bag called My Tokens, the same thing as the folder name that I created. Opening that up, I have access to all of these tokens. Now, if this is too far zoomed out, you can zoom in using this plus button, and you can get a better view of the tokens, and you can zoom out. You can also move them around if necessary, or rearrange them. So that is your GM tokens. Now, it's important to remember that all of these tokens here in the host directory are going to be available on every campaign that the DM loads. So if you have large numbers of tokens, you'll be using up a lot of RAM each time you load it. So you only want to limit it to the ones that you're actually going to need. The other directory is this shared directory, and this directory is shared with your players. Now, clicking on these buttons will point directly to these directories. So if I close this and I click on the shared button, it's going to open it up right to where I was, to this shared directory. And again, I can have directories inside here. In this case, I have one called dropped objects. This is something that I use in my game for when players are using a weapon and or an item, and they drop it because they need to draw something else in combat. And this is just a series of images that they can use to represent their dropped object. And this appears here, of course, as a folder somewhere here, dropped objects. You'll notice that this folder has this little head symbol in the bottom right hand. That indicates that this bag is shared with the players. So that lets you know which tokens are shared. If I double click on it, it of course will display all of the tokens that are available to me. If I want to add tokens to that directory, I can do the same thing. I can create, perhaps you want your players to be able to see or have access to certain tokens. I'm just going to call it the new folder directory, and I'm going to copy a few of these Goblin tokens to here as well. So now when I close that, there will be a new directory called new folder, and it has a few additional Goblin pictures available to me. So those are the two ways that you can add tokens to everything. So the shared tokens, the ones in the shared folder, are again going to be available on every campaign the DM runs from that host PC. The GM folder is every campaign that the DM runs from that PC, but only available to the DM. Now, there is an additional way that you can add tokens to your campaign that is campaign specific. In other words, it'll be available for that campaign only and not if any other campaigns are loaded. So to get to there, we'll go ahead and open up our tokens window, but we're going to back up to the Fantasy Grounds data folder. And then we'll come into campaigns and find the campaign that you want your tokens to be limited to. So if I come here to, in this case, my recording 5e, since that's the campaign I currently have loaded, and I can see all of my campaign files. To add tokens here, we're going to go ahead and create a folder. There's not a tokens folder by default, but we're going to create a new folder here and just call it tokens. And now we can copy tokens into this tokens folder. So let's go ahead and copy some hobgoblins. And we'll copy them over, so now they exist here in this campaign tokens directory. Now once I do that, it will again add a new one. This one now is titled campaign. So that campaign folder is there. If I drill in there, now I have access to all of these hobgoblin images. Now the tokens that are added to the campaign folder will only be available when that particular campaign is loaded. So if you have a bunch of tokens that are specific to a campaign, like a character's specific token or an NPC that's specific to a particular campaign, or other objects, you can add them directly there, as opposed to using up the shared folder or the GM folder, which will then be available across all of the campaigns. Thank you.